It's strange how the quietest hours of the night can make a voice feel louder than any scream. This story begins in a cramped, dimly lit radio booth on the outskirts of Melbourne in 1997. The kind of late-night show most people stumbled onto by accident, half static, half murmured music, with the occasional lonely caller to keep the host from drifting off. The host's name was Daniel Kline, a man in his late 30s with a smoker's voice and a habit of sipping cold coffee from a chipped mug. His show was called After Midnight, a space for insomniacs, truck drivers, and night shift workers to vent, confess, or simply fill the silence. But that winter, the silence was broken by something else. It began on a Tuesday night, the air outside heavy with mist. Daniel was halfway through playing an old Tom Waits track when the phone line lit up. He pressed the blinking button, leaning toward the microphone. "You're on After Midnight. Who's calling?" The voice that answered was deep but slow, each word deliberate, as if carefully chosen. "I'm the third caller," it said. Daniel frowned, checking the log. No, this was the first call of the night. "Third caller for what?" he asked. There was a pause. You could hear faint static, but beneath it, something else, a rhythmic tapping, like fingernails against wood. "Third to call, before it happens," the voice replied. And then the line went dead. Daniel was used to prank calls, especially from drunk students. He rolled his eyes, played the next track, and forgot about it. 2 nights later, it happened again. The voice was identical, low, calm, disturbingly measured. "I'm the third caller," it said. "Yeah, we've been through this," Daniel chuckled. "Third for what?" "Third before she dies," the man answered. This time, Daniel noticed the tapping was faster, almost impatient, and then silence. Daniel logged the call, but there was no number, just unavailable on the screen. The third time was on a Sunday. Daniel picked up before the second ring. "You're the third caller," the man said immediately. No greeting, no introduction. Daniel tried to play along. "All right then, who are the first two?" There was a long pause. When the man finally spoke, his voice dropped to a whisper so faint that Daniel had to turn the volume up. "You'll hear them soon." Then the sound changed. The tapping was gone, replaced by what Daniel swore was the sound of shallow breathing, close to the microphone. And just before the call cut out, the man whispered, "Watch the news tomorrow." Daniel didn't sleep that night. He left the station as the sun was rising, went home, and sat at his kitchen table with the radio on low. The morning news came at 8 a.m. The lead story chilled him. A 27-year-old woman had been found dead in her apartment, strangled. The estimated time of death was around 1:15 a.m. Daniel checked his station logs. The strange call, 1:12 a.m. From then on, the man called once a week, always saying the same thing, always claiming to be the third caller, and disturbingly always predicting a death within hours. The victims were all women, living alone, in different parts of the city. No signs of forced entry. Daniel went to the police. He handed over recordings, but they dismissed it as coincidence, or the ramblings of someone with inside knowledge of unrelated crimes. Still, they agreed to monitor the station lines. Weeks passed. Each time the man's calls grew more unnerving. Sometimes Daniel could hear faint music behind him, old jazz standards from the 40s, scratchy as if played on vinyl. Other times, there was a strange clicking, like a rotary phone being dialed over and over. The worst was the night the man finally used Daniel's name. "I'm the third caller, Daniel." Daniel froze. He hadn't given it. "What do you want from me?" he asked. There was no pause this time. "To make you the first." And the line went dead. The police took that one seriously. They assigned an officer to sit in the booth with him during broadcasts. For 2 weeks, the man didn't call. Daniel began to think it was over. Then, on a Thursday, with the officer sitting right beside him, the line lit up. Daniel looked at the cop, who gave a nod. He answered, "You're on after midnight." "I'm the third caller," the voice said. The officer's eyes widened. He could hear it too. "Third before what?" Daniel asked, his throat dry. "This time," the man said, "before they find her." "Find who?" Daniel demanded. The voice laughed softly, like air escaping a tire. "She's closer than you think." Suddenly, a muffled thud came from somewhere behind the booth wall. Both men jumped. The officer sprang to his feet, yanked open the door, and disappeared into the hallway. Moments later, Daniel heard him shout for backup. Behind the station, in the narrow alley, they found the body of a young woman. She'd been dead for hours. No identification, no sign of struggle. Just a strange detail. In her pocket was a small cassette tape labeled 3. Forensics found nothing on the tape except a faint recording of Daniel's own voice, taken from an old broadcast years earlier. The segment? Him answering a call saying, "You're on after midnight." The station tightened security. Daniel began screening calls before going live. The show's tone changed, less music, more filler, as he tried to avoid the man's voice. For 3 months, it worked. Then, one night in early spring, just before closing the show, the studio phone rang. It wasn't on the main line. It was the old rotary phone in the back corner, one that had been disconnected years ago. Daniel stared at it, the sound of the mechanical bell echoing in the small room. Against every instinct, he picked it up. No static this time, no tapping, just breathing. "I'm the third caller," the man said. His voice was softer now, almost gentle. Daniel, gripping the receiver so hard his knuckles ached, said nothing. The man continued, "You've been the first for too long, Daniel. Time to move you down the list." The line clicked, and then another voice. A woman's voice, faint, trembling. "Help me," she whispered. Then silence. Daniel dropped the phone. The officer on duty searched the entire building. No one was there. That night, Daniel quit radio for good. He left Melbourne, moved across the country, and refused all interviews. But 3 years later, a small-town newspaper in Western Australia ran a peculiar story. A retired radio host had been found dead in his home. No signs of struggle, no forced entry. On the floor beside his body was a cassette tape. Written on it, in neat block letters, was a single number, 1. To this day, the identity of the third caller has never been discovered. No arrests were made. The tapes remain in police evidence, locked away. But the strangest part, the current host of After Midnight, a woman named Claire, swears she sometimes hears a faint tapping on the line when she answers her first call of the night. And once, on a rainy Wednesday, she swears she heard someone whisper, "I'm the third caller."